Zelensky told Trump at the end of the call he would give him a championship belt from Ukrainian heavyweight boxer Alexander Usyk, right? It was like, oh, I'm going to get a beautiful belt. It's like Muhammad Ali's belt. It's coming from Ukraine. The next step, I'm not kidding. The next step is extremely hot Ukrainian women in a delegation to the White House.
Rare earth minerals, championship belt, hot blondes. All right, we're back with friend of the show, editor of The Insider, a Russia-focused independent media outlet, former investigative reporter for CNN. He's the author of ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror, and has a forthcoming book about the GRU, Russia's intel agency. It's Michael Weiss. How you doing, man?
I'm well. How are you?
Lots happening. We had a bilateral press conference with Modi yesterday, and as well as an Oval Office press conference about the negotiation, if we want to call it that, with Russia. We're getting some mixed signals from Trump and Hegseth and Vance on this matter, and so I want to get into the details of what we heard at the press conference. But I want to start with this question that was posed by Matt Pierce. What is the foreign policy of the U.S. government right now?
I don't think the U.S. government is quite sure of that, to be honest. You're seeing a lot of contradictory lines of communication, and I think it's indicative of just sort of how amateur the current lineup is. Hegseth, from what I've been able to report so far, was not cleared to give the statement he gave, which sort of blew back in his face. He's had to walk it back. It's been repudiated by other members of the administration. Wicker and others.
But then Trump basically kind of concurred with it. Also.
Yeah, well, evidently, the original draft of what Hegseth was going to say alluded to the Istanbul deal in the early part of the war, which the Russians keep citing as evidence that the Ukrainians missed an opportunity to end the war. Complete fugazi nonsense. It was really bad. And I'm hearing it was actually DOD staffers, many of them from Koch-funded think tanks, who ended up drafting this thing. I mean, Hegseth is a guy who strikes me, he probably thought NATO was a type of mezcal before his confirmation hearing, right? I mean, not the sharpest tool in the shed, and very easily manipulated in running one of the largest entities in the world, which is the Pentagon. Yeah. Trump, too, saying a lot of strange and unpleasant and alarming things. I mean, my European friends are like, oh, so he wants to cut American military spending in half, which would make the percentage of America's GDP that is spent on defense something like 1.68%. Meanwhile, he wants all NATO allies to spend 5%. So that's, physician heal thyself. And then he wants the burden to, of course, be passed to the Europeans to sustain a war that he also says is going to be wrapped up in short order with a beautiful peace deal that nobody knows the contours or details of, because I don't think he does. But I mean, Hegseth's amateur rookie mistake was to offer everything up to the Russians that they want, by the way, in advance of even entering into negotiations. So, foreclosing on the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. It's an open secret that Ukraine is not going to be in NATO in the short or midterm, right? Biden says the future of Ukraine is in NATO, but at the Vilnius summit several summers ago, the Ukrainians were hopping mad that there was no credible path for accession, right? So that's an obvious thing. He says that Ukraine cannot claw back all the territory it controlled in 2014. Well, President Zelensky has essentially said the same thing, and that's not even an open secret. That's just accepted reality. But again, you don't articulate these things publicly and affirm them before you enter into what is going to be a very prolonged and possibly nasty and arduous set of negotiations with the Russians. So the Russians, I think, were kind of rubbing their hands with glee about this. But now you have this weird stuff happening. J.D. Vance.
Just real quick before you get to J.D. Vance, the funniest part of the Hegseth presser for me, and everyone would be dumber for having listened to it, so we're not going to pull the full audio of this, but people can Google it if they want. He was asked, like, what... You've told us what concessions that you're asking for from Ukraine. What concessions are you asking for from Russia?
Right.
And his answer was like, hamina, Mr. Trump strong. And like he goes on for 2 minutes with nothing. Like he had nothing. Right? There wasn't even a fig leaf.
Right, and he's probably not even aware of what concessions could be wrung from Russia.
Right.
There are a couple of things that are happening right now, which make all of this incredibly ill-timed. The first is there are Republicans who are putting forth a suite of possible sanctions against Russia that would really hammer the energy economy. I mean, basically destroy Russia's economy even more so than it has been already, right? If Biden administration sanctions were a 6 out of 10, this would ratchet it up to about an 8 or 9 out of 10. This is probably something that the Trump administration will not do, but at least they could use it as a cudgel or as a threat that if you do not meet us to the point at which we need to be met for any kind of negotiations, we have this at our disposal, right? Nobody's talking about that. The second thing is that actually the Russians are performing quite poorly right now on the battlefield. They are slowing down in the pace of their advance in Donbass. I'm hearing reports, credible reports from Ukrainian officers in the field that their rate of fires is dramatically reduced along the contact line. So basically they're not bombing, they're not hitting the Ukrainians with artillery anymore. Whether or not this is a hiccup that gets adapted and goes away on the Russian side, or whether or not it's an indicative of something more systemic and problematic in their war machinery, I don't know. But it seems like now is the time to pause and maybe wait and find out before we start giving the store away for free. And keep in mind, Putin doesn't just want a U.S. president to say Ukraine will not be in NATO. Biden kind of sort of came close, and before the full-scale invasion, that administration was essentially offering that to the Russian side as a way to stop them from invading. Putin has been around long enough, several presidents on the American side. He wants a treaty, which means he wants it ratified by Congress, that NATO expansion, that essentially Russia gets a veto on NATO expansion, that they will not incorporate more countries. That's not going to happen in Congress, even under this current GOP, right? But suddenly, we are bending over backwards to try and convince the Russians that Ukraine will not be in NATO ever. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be using the very kind of slowness of our own political machinery as an advantage on our side of the ledger. We're not doing that either. So it's a very bizarre kind of time to sort of insist that Ukraine be wrapped up here. And the third point I should make, and this comes right from the mind of Tucker Carlson, who has made a few trips to Russia. It is absolutely one of the demands of the Kremlin, is that Ukraine have elections. They do not want Zelensky, the wartime president, to remain wartime president. They think, and this I think is more suggestive of how the Russians completely misread the Ukrainian body politic, which landed them in this mess of invading when they thought the entire population would greet them as liberators and go over to their side. They think that they can install, through their bag of dirty tricks, election interference, political warfare, a more pliant asset in Kyiv who will certify any deal that essentially cedes the sovereignty of the country over to Russia. Zelensky is still, I think, the most favored candidate in whatever polling is being conducted now. But all that to one side, there is no Ukrainian politician who's going to emerge to say, we must look eastward once again. There's no Yanukovych in the offing here, right? Everybody wants to be part of the EU. Everybody sees themselves as a member of the Western community. The Russians don't appreciate that fact. But we seem to be now suggesting, Bloomberg just had a piece today that the Trump people are telling Zelensky, you have to have elections. The sheer logistics of which are going to be quite difficult because 20% of the country is occupied. Missiles are still landing into Kyiv and Kharkiv, and you're going to have a ceasefire before, which will be kind of fitfully maintained, and then you're going to go to the polls. It doesn't make much sense, but this is another demand the Russians.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think Putin ultimately wants, but I want to before we get Michael Weiss' take, I want to listen to what Trump thinks and whether he trusts that Putin is dealing with him in good faith. This was him yesterday in the Oval Office.
Says that he really wants peace. Do you believe him?
Yeah, I do. I believe he wants peace. I believe that President Putin, when I spoke to him yesterday, I know him very well. Yeah, I think he wants peace. I think he would tell me if he didn't. I'd like to see peace.
Do you trust President Putin?
I believe that, I believe that he would like to see something happen. I trust him on this subject.
Trust him on this subject.
He would tell me if he were lying.
He would.
The KGB case officer, he wouldn't do the dirty on me.
because we have such a good relationship.
Yeah.
So, I mean, totally preposterous, almost ridiculous to even take it seriously if he wasn't the president of the United States. But I am curious, like, what you think Putin wants out of this current negotiation, because it is, I think it's a little opaque, right? And it kind of is related to your point about the weakening on the battlefield, right? I mean, I think that there was some thinking that maybe he didn't even really want a peace deal, when Russia was pressing ahead, but maybe he kind of does want a temporary pause now. I don't know. What do you suspect? Do some Kremlinology for me.
Well, I mean, I think they want to drag this out as much as possible. A de facto ceasefire or anything that lowers the temperature is a boon for the Russians because it'll allow them to regenerate their forces. It'll allow them to kind of pause and reconstitute and, bring new kit to the front, dial up more North Koreans that they can send into Kursk, whatever. I mean, but it also, frankly speaking, allow the Ukrainians to do the same thing. I mean,
Sure.
Ukrainians are suffering pretty badly themselves. I mean, this is a matter of population differences. One of the big points of vulnerability for Zelensky is his refusal to lower the draft age to 18 and bring more younger people to the. I mean, you've got 40-something-year-olds, in some cases geriatrics, who are now in trenches in Donbass fighting on the Ukrainian side. So they have a problem with manpower. But ultimately, look, I think the Russians understand that this is going to be a process. And so what they're trying to do is set the sort of players correctly such that they can get the maximum concessions from the American side. They don't really believe in negotiating with the Ukrainians at all. Remember, Ukraine has no agency. It practically does not exist as a sovereign entity unto itself. For them, this is really a war with the United States and NATO. So they want to talk only to Washington. And who do they want to talk to? So I think it was interesting. There was some misreporting that Kellogg, the special envoy to Ukraine, was not going to Munich at all. When Trump did his Truth Social post about this, sort of the preliminaries of this discussion, he did not mention Kellogg. Witkoff, his buddy, a fellow billionaire, the guy who got the American school teacher released by the Russian side, that's all purposive. The Russians see Witkoff as their man, not because he's necessarily pro-Russian, but he doesn't understand anything about this part of the world. He's completely green, whereas Kellogg lives, breathes, and speaks Ukraine, Russia, 24/7. That's his portfolio.
You can also probably do some back channel deals with him because Witkoff's son is the co-owner of the Trump crypto scheme with the Trump kids. So the Trump kids and the Witkoff kids are together on their cryptocurrency.
Right. And also to the Russian mind, I mean, Witkoff is just another oligarch, a boyar who is surrounded by the czar on the American side. So
I mean, that's about as close as you can get. I mean, there isn't a great example in recent time where we have a president who appointed his business partner's dad to a special envoy position, right? Like, I mean, it's pretty similar actually to the Russian
I mean,
setup.
It's a political system that is governed by cronyism and back scratching. And so but Witkoff, they think, especially with the sweetener of this unexpected exchange of on our side, we had a crypto grifting criminal that we gave to the Russians, and they had a school teacher hostage. They think that they've now incentivized Trump to play nice, and by all accounts, he is. Again, he trusts Putin, arguably more so than he does his own ministers. And
certainly more than Europe. Let's because I thought this was telling also from yesterday, and this is I'm curious your view on how the Europeans are processing all this, because he was asked about working with Europe in these negotiations. I don't remember if I mentioned it, but he's floated the idea that there's a spring summit in Saudi Arabia. So home turf for Putin in the negotiations. And so the question was about whether he'd be working with Europe on that. And his answer is pretty gobsmacking. Let's listen.
And we told the European Union, we told the NATO people, largely they overlap, you have to pay more money because it's unfair what we're doing. We're doing a tremendous amount more. We're probably $200 billion more going into Ukraine, using for Ukraine to fight. And Europe has not really carried its weight in terms of the money. It's not equitable. And we want to see a counterbalance. We want to have them put up more money. They have to do that. At the same time, we had a very good conversation with President Putin.
So the question again was, are you going to be working with Europe on the negotiation? The answer there was trashing Europe and then reiterating that he had a great talk with Putin.
Right. And expecting Europe to essentially shoulder. By the way, I mean, Europe does spend almost as much as we do on Ukraine. And if you measure it in both military and humanitarian assistance, I think you could even come up with a figure that's greater than what the U.S. is doing. So this is nonsense. Look, I'm an advocate for every NATO member to meet the 3% threshold for defense spending. I think it's a good idea. The Europeans have been talking about this since time immemorial. I mean, it was part of Macron's sort of, what did he call it? His sovereign hegemony, or he changed the term of art multiple times. But, the idea of Europe being able to defend itself outside of the American security umbrella is a good one. And especially it's a good one now that America is, fast becoming the Venezuela of North America. We might not be able to do things that we used to do before. And a lot of Europeans are very much in favor of this, which is why literally a few hours ago, van der Leyen announced at Munich that she's going to propose activating the escape clause for defense investments, which will allow European countries to spend even more on defense. And that would, of course, help sustain the war in Ukraine. But, we've discussed before, and I want to reiterate this because it's very important. There is this grand misconception, and it is especially lapped up by the MAGA types, that the way that American security assistance for Ukraine works is, pallets of cash on transport planes delivered to Kyiv. Zelensky pockets half of it, buys yachts in the Mediterranean or whatever. Look, we spend the money here in the United States. The vast, overwhelming majority of the money that has been allocated for Ukraine gets invested in the U.S. It opens factories to manufacture artillery shells, weapon systems, modernizing our own arsenal, hiring American workers. It used to be a MAGA conceit that, put the money here and bring our own proletariat up from its knees. All of these things get met with security assistance to Ukraine. And the best part is the stuff we end up giving them are old, outdated weapon systems. They still work, and they still work a lot better than Russia's state-of-the-art weaponry. They're all too grateful to receive them. And then we end up revitalizing and modernizing our own military. The American Enterprise Institute also did a recent study that showed what would happen if Ukraine were to lose the war and Russia were to conquer this country in terms of America's defense posture in Europe. Now, assuming that we have any interest whatsoever in a defense posture in Europe and that we're part of NATO and that, we want to have a deterrent capability, they calculated it would cost $808 billion to the American taxpayer over the course of the next 5 years, an increase in $808 billion to essentially get our house in order in terms of air defense, sea defense,
right,
personnel, logistics, all the things that would have to be brought to bear to Europe, because the border that NATO would share with Russia would grow exponentially as a result of Ukraine's defeat. Yeah. So if you approach this purely from a utilitarian accounting,
I mean, that assumes that they would then decide that they would want to defend that whole border.
Right.
And
if you're a businessman, this is the greatest investment you can possibly make because, and I don't mean to be cynical here, the Ukrainians make this argument too. We're not fighting a war with our strategic adversary. They are. We're helping them. We are bleeding Russia dry on a European battlefield such that Russia cannot invade another ally, a NATO ally, thus triggering Article 5, thus bringing the United States into a shooting war with Russia. And at the same time, we are upgrading our own arsenal. What's not to like about this if all you care about is the money? I mean, and I purposefully leave aside the moral imperative and, the values and all the, bright shining city on a hill stuff, because most people that we're trying to persuade don't even care about that, right? They just want to know what's in it for me. What do we get out of this? The answer is you get quite a lot. You just don't realize it.
There were a couple of other noteworthy statements from the two pressers. I'm just going to lump them all together and get your take. Trump wants Russia back in the G7. Apparently, you referenced earlier that he said that he wants to meet with Putin and Xi and talk about cutting our military budgets in half, all of them. He went on a pretty negative tirade about Taiwan during one of the press conferences and about how they're stealing our jobs. You take all that together, and I think it paints a pretty clear picture of what kind of world Trump wants to leave everybody. But I'm wondering what you think about all that.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when spending money on Ukraine meant we weren't spending enough on Taiwan to defend them from the imminent and inevitable Chinese invasion.
Right.
Yeah. So now all of a sudden, Taiwan is our enemy or our rival.
They just
taking our jobs.
They annoy us,
stealing our microprocessing industry, and they annoy us. So that doesn't sound like we're coming to their defense either. I mean, look, you have a guy who fundamentally, he doesn't care about allies. He doesn't even really care about national or strategic interests. He cares about transactions. What's in it for me? What am I getting out of this? Right? Everything else is just a dodge or a hustle, or he thinks that, we're being taken for a ride, and all these other countries, they're the welfare queens of Pax Americana. He doesn't understand the implications of just forfeiting, our role in the world and allowing these countries to be gobbled up by their regional adversaries, who then become, of course, and are already actually America's strategic adversaries. So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, given his style and his mode of thinking. The countries that he tends to get on with the best, he would love to get on with Putin and Russia. There are some hurdles in the way here, but we've been discussing what they are. He loves Erdogan and Turkey, because Erdogan has sort of managed democracy such that he's sort of the president/dictator in perpetuity, right? And he likes what Turkey has done, which is taken over Syria, because Bashar al-Assad pissed off the Sultan. He can get along with a guy like that. He likes Netanyahu, and Netanyahu sure loves him. Taj Mahal, Khan Yunis, David Petraeus as pit boss in Gaza. I mean, what's not to like there, right? Like riverfront property, the new Riviera, in the most volatile and hostile piece of real estate in the Middle East.
Never seen Bibi smile so wide.
Never smiled so wide as when he saw that. And Viktor Orban as well, who has managed to do the same kind of state capture in Hungary, although he's small beer, because Hungary doesn't matter to the extent that these other countries do. Those are the only people that he sort of likes the cut of their jib. Everybody else is like, all right, show me where on this dotted line I get what I want out of this, right? And, the Ukrainians, to their credit, I think, have begun trying to play to some of these personality defects and this sort of egomania. You'll notice Axios had a write-up of the Trump-Zelensky call, and among it's a minor point, but it's, I think, kind of evocative of the way the Ukrainians now see the lay of the land. It says, Zelensky told Trump at the end of the call he would give him a championship belt from Ukrainian heavyweight boxer Alexander Usyk, right? It was like, oh, I'm going to get a beautiful belt. It's like Muhammad Ali's belt. It's coming from Ukraine. The next step, I'm not kidding. The next step is extremely hot Ukrainian women in a delegation to the White House.
Rare earth minerals, championship belt, hot blondes.
Rare earth minerals, lithium and all the stuff that goes into microprocessing. That idea came from Ron Lauder, by the way, who also gave him the idea, why don't we take Greenland? Because why the hell not? What's Greenland and who lives there? So, again, it's like his businessmen friends, fellow oligarchs, tell him, hey, this is, what I would do in your position. Let's talk about hostile takeovers, It's like that Danny DeVito movie from the 80s, Other People's Money. Like, that's how Trump is governing as president.
It's comforting to know that one of the co-founders of the Estee Lauder Cosmetics company is leading our foreign policy. But if that doesn't leave you with any a chill down your spine, did you see the other special advisor who was traveling with JD Vance? And I think he was on 2 trips, actually, 2 of the overseas trips. This is my pal, Pizzagate Jack Posobiec.
Oh, yeah. Pizzagate guy. Yeah.
Yeah, Pizzagate Jack. He was, you might remember him from being at the pizza restaurant in D.C. where people were saying there was the frazzle drip happening in the basement where there was no basement, to like kind of live streaming from there, trying to get to the truth, get to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
He just has a massive hit list of conspiracies mongering. And I guess he's like, he's in the inside circle. It's him, the crypto friends, and the Estee Lauder guy. And this is sort of who's the brain trust.
And just to underscore kind of the willy-nilly nature of all of this, because you really don't. People are very sure about what's going to happen. I'm not so sure because I don't know, who's got the president's ear or what kind of impression has been made. I mean, to send out J.D. Vance, who is the most hostile to Ukraine person in the U.S. government.
Yeah.
I mean, his staff really hate Ukraine.
He literally said, I don't care what happens to Ukraine.
Not only, I'll give you an anecdote. I know some dyed-in-the-wool hardcore Republicans who were fine with Trump. When he picked Vance as a running mate, I got calls, vote for Biden, vote for Biden, vote for Biden. Why? It's like, his staff, particularly James Braid, his legislative director, like these guys are like crazy, like beyond Cato Institute libertarian isolationists. They think sanctions on Iran are escalatory. We can't get anything done with these people, right? So Vance they saw as the real ideal. So now he sends J.D. Vance out after Hegseth steps on his own crank. Yeah. And Vance goes, we might go to war with Russia if they don't do what we want. Well, hang on a minute. You were the guy who said, I don't care what happens to Ukraine. Now you say all options are on the table with the Russians. Now, I get it.
It's kind of like bluffing, but turning over your two twos, and also bluffing. So people can see what you got.
Right. So you wanted me to do Kremlinology on the Russian side. If I do Kremlinology on the American side, I think they sent this guy to say this so they can kind of appear tough to a domestic audience. But the Russians really understand that J.D. Vance doesn't believe a word of what he's saying, right? So this is all just face saving for Trump. Look, the shafts of light here are Ukraine does get a say in its own future and fortune, right? Yeah. Everybody who asked me about, what's their sovereignty if the United States? Remember, according to the United States, Ukraine should not exist right now. Even under the Biden administration, they had 3 days until Kyiv was toast, 2 weeks until the entire country was conquered by the Russian army. And they fought back. They did what we told them they couldn't do, and they succeeded. So they're clever and they're innovative and they'll find ways to resist. Number two, if the Europeans really are serious about saving this country, which they should be, not everything Trump says is wrong. When he says this affects Europe more than it affects us, he's right. It's on their doorstep. So the problem is they have to get their act together, particularly the Germans. But even without the Germans, I mean, if you look at the coalition of the most hawkish pro-Ukraine countries who have given orders of magnitude, by proportion of weapons and money, you've got all the Scandinavian countries, you've got Sweden, you've got Denmark, which has emptied its stocks of artillery howitzers, the Baltic states, my friends in Estonia, I mean, their intelligence has single-handedly, frankly, helped Kyiv survive in the early days of the war. They're the ones that told them about the air bridge that was being brought over by the Russian side. The Poles aren't going anywhere. The Brits are fine Tory labor. They compete with each other to be more pro-Ukraine. You actually have a pretty good assemblage of nations, all NATO members, by the way, that can help this country survive and fight back. So again, I understand the inclination toward pessimism, if not catastrophism. But the good news is, America as kind of a fallen or dilapidated power has empowered others to realize that they kind of have to take fortune into their own hands, as it were. And they need plan B and plan C. And I think, one of the odd things about this election, and I think I mentioned this on the show the last time, is Europeans were not as aggrieved and panic-stricken as a lot of Americans were. They thought it was inevitable Trump was going to come back. And there have been things in place for the last 4 years that anticipated this contingency. So I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about this. I'm not. But I do think that, we should not be writing Ukraine's obituary so prematurely.
Let's send people into the weekend with some green shoots. And I guess just a brief update. Can you tell us what's happening with the aviary in your home? Are you doing this from inside? Yeah, are you doing this from inside a birdhouse at the Central Park Zoo, or where are we?
As I'm talking to you, my daughter just left on a weekend holiday to Maine with her best friend from school and their parents. I've got 2 squawking budgies in I don't know what room. We have to move them around because my golden doodle, who has gone from 10 pounds to 40 pounds in the space of like 6 weeks, and whose permanent teeth magically came in overnight, like overnight oats, he terrifies the birds. So I have a menagerie that's deeply dysfunctional and at odds with itself in this house, and a lot of stuff going on here. And thanks for being patient. I'm sorry for the background noise, but
No, it's lovely. We'll just have to bring the budgies on to the next visit. Thanks so much, man.